So we have kind of an unusual configuration today for our visit, and I'm excited about it. Christopher Tyler Nickel is a composer who's written a lot of music for a variety of idioms, and he wrote a wonderful oboe concerto for orchestra and oboe in its original form that we were going to premiere the wind ensemble version of at the end of May with Mary Lynch, the principal oboist of Seattle Symphony, who's with us here, who teaches oboe for us and has done a fabulous job in that with our students, which we're so very appreciative. So Mary and Christopher, kind of what we do is to sort of get people going and thinking so that they can ask questions and sort of converse with you guys, is to sort of talk about, first of all, our background, just kind of your life in music, how you came to music, you know, when you first decided it was what you wanted to do. Some people have talked about the fact that they didn't really choose music, music sort of chose them, and have recounted that first moment, you know, when they knew they were going that way. And then just your journey, your professional journey to get to where you are to get today, because both of you guys have done great things, obviously. And I think that students sometimes, you know, naively think that it's a pretty easy path, that things just sort of, you know, fall in line. But all of us who have been able to work in music know that that's never the case. It's can be a pretty torturous path. So Mary, why don't you start, and then Christopher, just chime in when you're ready. And just for our guests, what we do when we don't talk is we hit mute, because if we don't hit mute, if you're not familiar with Zoom, you probably are, it immediately goes to your picture. So that's what we're going to do, and whoever wants to start, have at it.
All right, I guess I'll start. First of all, hi everybody. Hi Chris, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you since like we recorded stuff.
Yeah,
so.
pretty much. Yeah, it's been a while. How are you doing?
I'm good, how are you?
Good, isolated.
Yeah, as we all should be, I suppose.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so I guess how I got started. I started playing music in my elementary school band program, probably like many of you. Yeah, and I actually started on the clarinet. Like most oboe players, I think we tend to not start on the oboe. So I played the clarinet for 4 years, and then I switched to the oboe. Before I knew what it sounded like, actually, my elementary school band teacher, he demonstrated all of the instruments, but he did not have an oboe with him. He just asked for kids who were up for a challenge to play the oboe. And that appealed to me, and I think also the fact that no one else played it appealed to me, so there we go. And I think I became very serious kind of for the first time about music after I'd been playing the oboe for a year, and I joined my local youth orchestra program. And I will never forget that. My first time playing in orchestra, you know, the oboes sit right in the middle, so you're just like surrounded by this sound. And we played the Borodin Polovetzian dances. So if any of you know that, it's a piece with choir. So I was like in heaven. And I knew that playing in an orchestra was like, it was something really special. I'd never really felt that way about anything else. And I think, you know, Dr. Saltzman wanted us to talk a little bit about our like struggles too. I think in general, I am extraordinarily lucky that my professional path has been relatively straightforward. Like I did the work, I took, well, I should say relatively straightforward. I took 17 auditions before I won a position, but I was able to win a job before I finished school. So that was very lucky, and I'm very grateful for that. But when I first started playing the oboe, although certain things came naturally to me, I think I had a harder time in the beginning than maybe a lot of other people. Like I auditioned for the, you know, the better youth orchestras, and I didn't get in, and I ended up improving very quickly once I went to Interlaken. I was fortunate enough to study at Interlochen for my last 2 years of high school. So I really had a chance to be surrounded by a bunch of people who were better than me. And I had a chance to practice for hours on end every day and study with an amazing teacher. So yeah, and from Interlochen, I went to the New England Conservatory, then Juilliard for my master's. My first job was second oboe in the Cleveland Orchestra, and then now I'm here. So that's the story.
I had no idea you were a clarinet player. That's pretty funny. So you went from one reed to two. You just needed the two reeds. I get it. That's pretty
I
cool.
guess so. I don't remember a thing on clarinet though, like not a single note. That knowledge has all been replaced.
Where did you grow up? You mentioned your band program. Where was that at?
Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C. Wow, wow. Was it a good band program? Was it a vibrant band program? Good for you.
Yeah, it was very good. I went to a parochial Catholic school for my first 11 years of school, and that archdiocese had a really strong band program, so there were a lot of good bands. It was a very vibrant program.
Yeah, that part of the country, Northern Virginia and DC, because of the service bands, there's so many really fine high school bands there. I've done some guest work in that area. It's really great. So you mentioned you'd auditioned for 17 orchestras. I want to seize on that for a minute.
Sure.
Most of my professional friends tell a similar tale. And so what was your expectation from the first audition to the 17th one? I mean, how did your expectations change, and how did your preparation change from audition to audition, given the disappointment of not making it, kind of thing?
Yeah. I never expected to win. Like, even when I won my first job, I remember the personnel manager of the Cleveland Orchestra came out. There were 4 of us left in the final round. And she just, blurted it out. Okay, the committee's chosen a winner, and it's Mary Lynch. And I screamed, what? So I think that was my mentality going into every audition. Like I never went in expecting to come out with a job. I think towards the end though, like by the time I was in grad school, I was really hoping, like I had a little extra fire under my belt to, really try to not give myself any excuses not to play my best. And I think it wasn't that way when I first started taking auditions, because I started when I was pretty young. My first professional audition that I took was for assistant principal in the Baltimore Symphony, and I was a sophomore in college. So I wasn't really ready for a professional job yet.
It's interesting, you probably know this, but I didn't know you went to Interlochen. There's a bunch of you guys, right? You and Donna and Ben and Bonnie. I'm trying to think if there's anybody else. So a number of our winter percussion faculty went to Interlochen. So what was that experience like? Clearly that's a hotbed. That's a breeding ground for excellence. Why?
I mean, the whole experience there was amazing for me. I just absolutely loved it. I mean, there are probably several reasons why. I think one of them is it tends to attract similar-minded people, like people who just want to focus on their art, and it attracts a lot of creative thinkers. And so the friendships that you make there end up being really inspiring and stimulating. And yeah, it was just the whole environment there. I think the work ethic was absolutely outstanding. There was hardly a single student that I can think of at that school who wasn't putting in their full effort. So that was inspiring for sure.
Was there any point at which, and I'll leave you alone after this, was there any point in your journey where you got up or you had a bad lesson or something went wrong and you were like, I hate the oboe. I'm throwing the oboe down the toilet. I've had it.
Oh yeah. I mean, that happens present tense more often. Like there isn't like one singular experience. That's kind of just like part of it. I actually remember a conversation I had with my oboe repair person, like when I was in college. And he's been sort of a mentor of mine. I've known him since I was 16 years old, and I really respect him. This is John Seimer for all the woodwind players out there. He's amazing. Anyway, I remember expressing to him like, oh, I'm so frustrated. I feel like I hate how I sound all the time. And like, am I ever not gonna be frustrated? And he told me, he's like, Mary, if you just thought you sound amazing, that you wouldn't be doing it right. Like, that means that you wouldn't be improving. So the fact that like your ears will always be a step beyond what you're capable of doing on the instrument, that's just like a fact of life, and you got to learn how to deal with it. And I think that was really good advice.
Right. Music is unrelenting in terms of the fact that perfection is the goal. So are you still able, knowing that, because you can sort of conceive that the way you play, we know that. Do you ever come out of concerts like super frustrated still today and, pound on yourself a little bit, and how do you recover from that?
Yeah, there are definitely some concerts, like, I mean, I'm human, so sometimes I make really stupid mistakes in public, and I walk out of that and I'm just like, oh God. And it just happens. Like, I think a couple things have made it easier to deal with over the years. One is the fact that like, I'm just gonna have more concerts next week. So like, it's not the end of the road. I can do better and it's okay. And the other thing is, I used to be so obsessed with perfection as like the goal. And now that's shifted, like, because I don't really believe in perfection, or perfection is so subjective, I guess. So I think I have this little thing that I sort of say to myself before a concert, and that's performing is an act of selflessness. It's an exercise in vulnerability. So if I leave that concert feeling like I have met that, then I feel good and I can forgive myself for whatever errors I make. So that's been a helpful mental shift for me.
That was a beautiful way to put it, really beautiful, because being in education as long as I've seen perfectionism ruin people's lives. It really does. It shipwrecks them.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it does. And it's you've come to terms with it. I think that's what you're saying about your own journey, that you've migrated to a place where you can go in and give your best and walk away. And that's what it is. That's what it is. Because the great players, they conceive of something that the rest of us don't get, for starters. And they don't reach it. And we sit there with our mouths open at how beautiful it was. So it's such an elusive standard and so subjective and crazy making. That's kind of the point. So, well, Christopher, we don't know each other. And I'm kind of excited to meet you here virtually. And,
yes, good to meet you as well.
Yeah, and I want to hear, you've got a really interesting resume with a real broad kind of swath that you're cutting in terms of your compositional life. So we're very interested in your journey and how you kind of got to this place where you're doing all these different things. So maybe you can let's do this sort of backwards. I've sent everybody your resume and your bio and your website and actually a recording of this piece as we've talked. So why don't you talk about what you're doing now, just briefly, with this big broad splash of stuff that you're doing, and then go back to the beginning and trace your journey. That'd be awesome to hear.
Probably making myself crazy with everything I'm doing currently. I've always enjoyed having my feet in two different worlds. I'm classically trained. So I came at it from a conservatory background. I was actually, played the oboe prior to this, and interestingly enough, served on clarinet as well.
Is that true? Is that?
Yeah, it is.
Did you know that, Mary? Did you know that he was a clarinet turned oboist?
I didn't know you played clarinet first.
Yeah, I started on clarinet, and then I felt better and chose oboe for no apparent good reason. But
I think you guys should get your clarinets out and play a duet online. Now that would be, I'd pay money for that. That would be sweet.
no, you wouldn't. Not for me, at least. You don't even play the oboe anymore. But I so. I've always wanted to have these two roads kind of in my life, and they fulfill very different aspects of, I think, my personality and what I enjoy doing. Writing for film and television is a very different discipline than writing for the concert hall, because it is all about somebody else's viewpoint on what the music should be and fulfilling that. And oftentimes they don't know the first thing about music, but they're very happy to dictate a lot of things to you, which, it's part of what it is, and it doesn't take away from what it is. But it is very interesting to work with different people collaboratively on projects, on shows, films, whatever it's going to be. And that fulfills a certain part of me that maybe started in the performance days of working with others. Because when you work as a composer, it's a very isolating lifestyle that, a lot of us, I'm sure these days, are making the joke that through this isolation, we really don't notice the difference, particularly because I'm still locked away in my studio doing the same thing I was doing 2 months ago. Writing for the concert hall is a little bit more about pushing yourself and having an opinion about something and being able to execute on that and challenging yourself to go into different directions, and working with other artists, which is a very different process than working with a producer, or in some cases 13 producers. A totally different kind of world. So that's a little bit of, I think, the performer in me that still wants to be involved in that world, but also wants to challenge myself to write what I want to write and to work on things like structure and architecture and unity of idea, and not have someone come in and tell me to just get rid of the strings here for no apparent reason or whatever it may be. So they both kind of feed each other in a certain way. It creates an interesting variety, I think, and kind of keeps me interested in doing it. So this oboe concerto is, I think, a great example of that. It started with me writing something for my teacher up here, who was the principal of the Vancouver Symphony, Roger Cole. And along the way of getting this recorded with a bunch of other things, I got to work with Mary and a fellow who played bass oboe on what will eventually be the CD, Harrison Lindsay, who's from Seattle as well. And it's interesting and fun to work with great musicians around you who bring life to these pieces in a way that when you're, say, doing a television series and it's all being realized electronically, you don't get that interaction, of course, and you don't get that life into it, which besides a few rare opportunities where there's enough budget for it, you don't generally get to work with very many live musicians. So it's a great process artistically.
So tell us how you started. Tell us how music drew you, or if you drew it or whatever. Let's hear the beginnings. That's always fun.
Yeah, I know a lot of different directions. I started playing piano when I was 5 or 6 and totally hated it, and quit after about 2 years, and didn't really do much musically from that point forward. For many, many years until but music was always around me. I think my parents had a very diverse collection of music in the house. I was listening to, Isaac Stern one weekend and the Beatles the next, and, you name it. It was all there. Neither of them is particularly musical, but it was always around me. I finally hit the point where a friend's father was into musicals and film scores, and something just kind of got in the brain, and I kind of went, hey, I'd like to not write that, but perform it. And so I quickly took the piano back up and rapidly finished. Up here we have the Royal Conservatory. So I went from grade 2 piano to grade 8 piano in, I guess, 2 years, 3 years, and quickly just finished it and started studying theory, and then hit band and took up the clarinet, as mentioned, and completely hated it. And it was a choice of either quitting band, and for some reason, and it came to me later on, there was a solo in one show that I had heard, and I thought it was a clarinet. It was actually an oboe, but I had said to my band director, hey, I want to play this oboe, because nobody else, of course, was playing it. You know, we all have similar stories this way. I think there's an oboe personality thing here. But no one else was playing it. But luckily for me, my band director had been a bassoon player. And so he knew what I was going to be up against in taking the instrument up. So the first thing he said to me was, you will not play oboe in my band without having a private teacher. And so I was sent to Roger Cole, who, as I said, is the principal up here in Vancouver. And I never played the oboe without his guidance. Like, I got the instrument, and the next day I was at his place for a lesson. And so I was brought into the world of reeds and all the rest of it very, very quickly. So I started doing that. So I took that up in grade 9. I was playing in the Vancouver Youth Orchestra about a year later, and I was lucky enough, I started actually getting gigs around town in my grade 11, grade 12 year. Grade 11, the I want to conduct bug hit me. And once again, had great band directors who never said no, but said, well, you better know what you're doing. So I got a conducting teacher who was the resident conductor of the Vancouver Symphony, a fellow by the name of Clyde Mitchell. So I started that, and then of course I also said to them, well, I want to compose. And so he said, well, you better know what you're doing. And off I went, finding score paper, talking to all the instrumentalists, how to play their instrument, how to write for it. And so in high school, I was conducting my own pieces and having them performed, and determined I really hated composing because it hurt my hand too much to sit there and write all these scores out. So that went by the wayside. And so through that, I finally hit university. And going into music is it's a difficult path. And so I tried 1 year of doing something else, and I did a year of psychology. And every single day went, I really should be doing music. And so after the first year, I was very, very happy to swap my major, although I lost all my scholarships in the process of changing schools, but I did so anyway. And instead of entering as an oboist, though, the composition bug had come back within that year. And so I entered as a composer, which is for anybody who heard me play the oboe, I'm sure it's probably for the better. But the best part for me of playing the oboe, I said this to Mary, was actually reed making. It's what I enjoyed the most. And I think it actually taught me how to be a good composer, because it teaches you how to work in isolation for long periods of time on trying to attain perfection, but you'll never ever achieve it.
With sharp objects, objects.
Yes.
It's dangerous. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so I entered as a composition major, and the rest is sort of as it went. I started getting my first professional gigs actually before I graduated, writing scores. And back then for me, it was pencil and paper, and I would get these films and we would put streamers on them and punches, and I would free conduct them. And that's how we did these gigs with small groups. And after that, I did a summer in New York studying, and then I did some private lessons in LA, and came back to Vancouver with very little money left in the bank account, especially after New York and a lot of very good CD shops that I went to. and wound up working at a music store here because you got to make money, and working on trying to get my resume going. And in the process, happened to meet a fellow who turned out he was was one of the busiest composers for film and television in Canada. And I became his assistant through total happenstance of recognizing a name on a score. He was purchasing a copy of Shostakovich's 11th Symphony at the music shop, and I went, "Hey, I recognize that name," and I started talking to him. And lo and behold, he was looking for an assistant, so I got in to pretty much the busiest studio in Canada, and built my career in conjunction with him. Like, he would bring me into meetings, he would throw me extra cues to write here, and on it kind of built until I built my own career out of it.
That's really crazy. That's amazing. What a break. Just
Yeah,
because you knew Shostakovich.
It's actually more happenstance than that. I was stocking the shelves, and the person who was working the front desk needed a bathroom break. I wasn't even supposed to be there. And I just was filling in at the front counter, and recognized the name from a magazine I'd been reading, and there you go.
That is super fun.
Yeah.
So now you're scoring quite a bit of film and television work, according to your website, video game music, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to kind of swing back to that ultimately with the group who's engaged, as you know, with this kind of online composition thing, because I think you could really speak into that in terms of the tech thing and kind of where we're at now. I'm curious about that. But before we do that, I'm very curious about Mary and the oboe concerto, how that all came to be, the orchestra that recorded the piece, your interactions with her. I want to hear from Mary about preparing all that and what that was like, and the session work. We haven't really done much conversation about that aspect of the music business yet with the students, and I think that would be great to hear. So from either of you, however you want to handle this, it would just be cool to hear the backstory here.
Sure. I mean, I can just say how I got involved. I got an email from, so one of the cellists in the Seattle Symphony also runs this recording business. So I got an email from him, putting in a plug for Christopher. Like, I have this great composer. He's putting together this amazing oboe album, because the album features a concerto for bass oboe d'amore, which I also played the d'amore concerto, and an oboe concerto. And so I thought, wow, that sounds really interesting. Although I got that request shortly after I had recorded the Dalbavie oboe concerto, which you may have heard. I did it with the Seattle Symphony a couple of years ago. And I was left reeling from that experience a little bit because the piece was so hard. So I don't know if Chris remembers, I was like a little hesitant to take on the project at first, but I'm really glad that I did.
Do you want to explain a little bit as maybe the difference in recording the Dalbavie and then what we did on ours, and maybe how that process was a little bit different? Because I think you guys went about it a little bit differently than we did.
Yeah, so I guess it's typical. I haven't done a ton of recording work, but there are typically a couple of different approaches. So for the Dalbavie concerto, we recorded it all live. So the entire orchestra plus me at the same time, all mic'd and everything, playing together. For Chris's concerto, they recorded the orchestra by itself and then me by myself, which was a unique challenge. I think, like, some things were easier, but some things were harder. But that resulted in the two of us doing a lot of prep work before. Like, I would, I can't remember if I sent you recordings or if I just asked for like slight adjustments, because Chris was putting together a click track for the orchestra to follow. And so, because we don't want to play everything utterly metronomically, that would sound a little musically stiff. We wanted to make sure that the music would still breathe and not sound like everyone was trying to fit things up vertically, that there was still a sense of like horizontal phrasing. So we did a lot of back and forth before the orchestra recorded, just to get a sense of what my timing for breaths and timing beginnings and ends of phrases was like. I don't know if
And
Chris.
so you did that here in town? Did you do the solo part here in town?
Yeah, we did it at Bastille, actually.
Yeah, very near my home, actually.
Oh,
Wow. So, and the orchestra was in LA. Am I right about that, or California?
No,
No.
we did the orchestra here as well.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
In
everything
Vancouver.
was here.
Yeah,
yeah.
great.
In Seattle at Bastyr as well.
Oh, at
Yeah.
Bastille. How about that?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's a beautiful space. Yeah.
I think everything was recorded on the same day. Is that right?
Yeah, we actually did it all on the same day.
Yeah. So they did the orchestra, and then I think we did a couple passages with me and the orchestra, and then the rest of it just with me alone.
So they recorded it, and you listened to them play with a click or no click? The click at the same time.
I think so.
Hmm.
I actually don't remember.
Wow. Is that the first time you've done something like this?
I had done a few recording gigs before where I had played with click, but it was certainly not something that was a usual thing for me.
Yeah, for a concerto, that's unusual. Oh, I mean, I don't know, but it seems like an unusual thing, and that would be so hard. So the click had built-in rubato. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah,
pretty
to
cool.
match, my interpretation.
Wow, wow, that's a big engineering job, it would seem. At
They
least,
did a good job. It felt remarkably natural.
right. So the students have the recording, and they know this is a big piece. This is like a half an hour long. And so talk a little bit about kind of the composer-performer interaction and sort of interpretive notions and kind of how they're passed back and forth. I'm particularly interested as a conductor in the disagreements and if there were some and how you kind of work through those.
I think I remember. So the biggest challenge for me, I think overall, was so this concerto was written in dedication of Roger Cole, Chris's teacher that he mentioned, the principal oboist of the Vancouver Symphony. And so I wanted to try to bring, like, to honor him and his style of playing, which is actually very different from mine, but also bring my own voice to it. And so sometimes, like, I remember asking you, Chris, if I could change, like, there were a few sections that were that had a lot of accents, and I wanted to see if, like, I could take some of them out or just like reorganize the phrasing a little bit. So there was some back and forth there.
Who conducted this session? Or was it
David
just
Saby actually did it.
great,
Yeah.
great. Well, cool. So let's go into the final product. Once you've done that, how much processing and mixing and how many hours does all that take? Because the students are about to enter into this kind of processing phase, production phase of some stems that they've recorded. So how does that work, Christopher? How long does it take for something like this?
Sure. Well, I'll just back up a little bit actually to the idea of the click and recording in isolation. It as much as I'm always a proponent of doing things acoustically on stage, especially for classical music, this actually came out of a little bit of a pragmatic solution to the bass oboe originally, because it is as fantastic of a player as anyone is. It's a fickle instrument, and there aren't. Mary, I think there's one other bass oboe concerto, maybe two. Yeah, it's something like that. So, you can see how we were very lucky to have a fantastic player and who had a very good instrument. But to kind of keep it contained, so we didn't have an entire orchestra standing around all day if we need to do retakes or whatever may or may not happen, because, again, assuming it's going to be a fickle instrument. We kind of went, okay, let's just do it on a click. Harrison was totally happy with that for the obvious reasons of safety. And we did the same thing. We created a sliding click track. So it worked so well that time that when I was talking to Mary about it, I kind of went, okay, well, should we do this again? Because again, the benefit is you don't have, in this case, pretty much, I think it was a 50 or 60 piece orchestra there the entire day. You're blocking off a time for the orchestra, and then the soloist can do take after take after take after take until we get it right. In Mary's case, it didn't actually take very many takes because she's fantastic, and it was just there. But it also gives you the ability to really control a lot of the nuance to that in terms of the recording and the sound that we're getting. So in terms of mixing, I didn't mix it. I don't like beyond doing, what I would do for a television series. I'm not a mixer. I don't even want to pretend to be a mixer. It's a unique skill set that some people are fantastic at, and I have no idea where I would sit on that, except I find it very tedious. It took a fellow by the name of Corey Krukenberg down in Seattle did the mix because he was the recording engineer for the session. And it took, I don't know how many hours he probably put into it, but it was about 2 weeks or so before I got the initial assembly of it. And so a lot of it for him is I'll do the editing and select the takes and in Pro Tools and try to cross cut what I can with the orchestra, or this section was better here, and do what we can to finesse it that way and to take the best, like the gold of the takes that we had. But then I kind of hand it over and he can do much more with it. Overall, in this project, it was in very good shape, so we didn't have to do too terribly much. The players were fantastic. But so once we kind of get through the mix, and I kind of brought it to a point, and then let Mary kind of listen to what was in there, what takes were in there, what takes she wanted to change out, and that kind of process. We went through a couple of revisions that way, and then we master it. And in the case of classical music, there's a big difference between mastering something, mixing and mastering for film and television, and mixing and mastering for a classical album release. In classical music, I think we still want to try and keep some dynamics to it, some dynamicism to it, and not compress the life out of it and turn it into a Hans Zimmer sounding score, which it's really, it's very effective for what they're doing, but it also takes away a lot of the life of what makes classical music, be it orchestra or wind ensemble, breathe, and the natural way an ensemble works together and creates the drama through dynamics and phrasing and all the rest of that. So you don't want to take that out of it. When you're processing electronic music, you don't have the life to it the same way. So a lot of the times you're actually kind of, and especially to have it survive a television mix, because it's going to be mixed over again with dialogue, you tend to want to have it a little bit more compressed. So there's two different ways about that, but we tried to keep the naturalness of the sound of where we were recording it, and the naturalness of Mary's performance, and the naturalness of the orchestra, without tinkering too terribly much with that sound. Because there's no reason to destroy it when it's sounding great in the hall as it is.
So how many takes? How long was the session work?
The session, we started 10 a.m. with the orchestra, and we actually had the orchestra done by early afternoon. And Mary, I think you came in about 2 o'clock or so, and we went to about dinner time.
Wow. For any of the wind ensemble students who haven't listened to this piece, shame on you. You need to do that like right away, not just to hear how great the piece is, but to hear Mary play, which is extraordinary. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
And there are so many first takes in that. It's amazing, and that speed is a testament to the preparation that was done by both soloists, as well as everybody, the orchestra, the engineers, and the conductors. So preparation always pays off.
Yeah, and that, knowing her a little bit, that's the way she rolls for sure. So you talked about just one last little tiny thing, Mary. You talked about trying to honor Roger. What is it about his playing that you were trying to pay homage to?
Well, Roger, he kind of plays the oboe like it's a trumpet. Like he can just like blast the sound out there. He plays with a super crisp articulation, and it's very much um, like in the foreground, not holding anything back. And I tend to be like, I kind of like flitting around and being flexible, and I enjoy like the more poetic, softer side of things. Like that's usually my go-to when I'm playing music. So I wanted to try to access that side of myself that was more like a trumpet player, that was a little bit more in your face, with but still being true to like my own voice.
Yeah, I think listening to it a few times as I did, yeah, you play like an orator there a little bit more than when we did the Higdon. No, seriously, I thought it was, you know, big, and I thought it was great that way. Not grandiose, but just triumphant, from time to time. It was neat. It was cool. So you talked about, one thing real quick, Christopher, you talked about Hans Zimmer. I happened to stumble across a YouTube video of him sitting on a couch with several other composers drinking wine. Have you seen this thing?
There's lots of them, yeah.
Yeah, and they're talking about stuff. And he was talking about the fact that sometimes in session work, he hires 32 basses. Is that possible? That's crazy. And how they sit in weird configurations. What's going on there? Why do they do that sort of thing?
He has him and his team, because it is very much a team. He has a couple hundred people, to my knowledge, who work down at his studio. They do this essentially to create a very full, unnaturally full, but full in terms of it serves what he's doing, sound. And because it's really non-traditional scoring in many ways, and it comes from a background of, he was a synthesizer programmer before he became who he is now, creating a big wall of sound quite often. And so a lot of it is sort of experimentation in terms of how far they can push the envelope sonically with the amount of instruments. And yeah, be it like 30 some odd basses, and then they'll record over another 40 violas or something to kind of create this very dark, rich sound. I've heard of sessions where he's had 20 trombones of all different varieties lined up going. And then they take all these stems back to remote control studios in Santa Monica, and they mix them all down and merge it in with a wall of synthesizers. And I think I know some people who have worked on projects that he's been involved in, and there's hundreds of tracks that get mixed down into these things, like just hundreds of them to create this sound. But that's his aesthetic, and so it really is glorified sampling in a certain way. Like they're using these instruments almost as samples.
Yeah, and he was even talking about weird configurations where there would be basses on both sides and then down the middle and cellos all over the place. I just thought it was all fascinating. And the whole time I'm just thinking about the money. Oh my gosh, the amount of money to hire all those players. It must be quite something.
Yeah, no, a lot of money to do that. And a lot of things that if you're doing an Atmos mix, or you're doing, 5.1 mixes, or, those kinds of things in a theatrical environment, you'll notice it to some degree, but in a regular world, you're not going to notice it as much. But there's definitely a ton of money there to do these things, to whatever result they are or not.
Yeah, I'm curious, this is being recorded, so you can't, we don't want to ask too.
I'll be careful with my responses.
Yeah, no, so the tendency, you tell me if I'm wrong, just as a layperson watching, I like movies. And I love Dunkirk. I love Dunkirk. I thought it was an incredible piece of art in so many ways. And I love the soundtrack. I love the electronica, sort of the electroacoustic aspect of it, and how they took Nimrod and played around with motives and then elongated, augmented Nimrod, which is one of the slowest, most elegiac things in the repertoire. I thought it was brilliant. And so that interplay of electronics and acoustic instruments is something that all the students that you're talking to are kind of messing with right now. So can you talk a little bit about needing to know that sort of thing, going into the world now as a music student, graduating out into the world, and how you view that as a necessary skill, or maybe you don't. I'm thinking you do, but anyway, that's the setup.
The setup. I'll take it and go with it. It's I always have to qualify because I do come from a bit more of a, I shouldn't say a bit more of, but classical music was my background and is my first love. I'm not a tech person naturally, and if you want to talk about challenges that I have kind of gone through in this business, one of them was going from the guy who's free conducting whatever quick orchestra he could put together to do a project, to working with the technology to be able to deliver sometimes a couple of shows a week, and being able to write quickly and do that. So as a composer working today, there's no way around it. You have to be able to produce a really good sounding product really, really quickly. I always say that the good side of today is anyone with a Mac and the right software can produce product. The bad side is anybody with a Mac and software can produce a product. It's a double-edged sword. So what I always say to people is, absolutely, you have to know how to mix. You have to know, how to write it. You have to know your software packages. You have to know how to be efficient with it. As somebody, as a musician working in LA at this point, or in New York, or any major center, London, that's doing these things, I think it's also quite important for them to know how to fit into this new world of recording, because sometimes it is quite unorthodox compared to the old, here's the cue, hi, Mr. Williams, we're starting at bar 1 and it's going to sound amazing, and off you go. It's changed quite a bit, and producers and directors are looking more and more and more for interesting sounds that are not just traditional anymore. And I think one of the biggest occurred in music for media is it's definitely become less individualist and more conformist by nature of what commercial music is. And I don't always think that that's the best thing. But it's also come to a point where it's a lot more now about creating atmosphere and a lot less about storytelling in what you would hear maybe in the 30s, 40s, 50s, or even through the 70s and early 80s. We're not looking for the Star Wars score anymore. They don't tend to be. They're looking for what you were saying, in Dunkirk, which is a little bit more about atmosphere and mood than it is about painting this picture either through leitmotifs or however else they want to do it. So it's just, that's the way it is. And, these things tend to be cyclic in a certain way. We went through certain fads in the 70s, which you can hear in various soundtracks, and, disco was in and all the rest of that. And, that it's great. It makes it relevant to the time period that it's from. And with technology opening so many new doors in terms of the sonic palette that people can access, that's a product of our time. And probably 100 years from now, looking back, you'll definitely know the scores that were produced in our era. But it is interesting to see how people like it. It almost is matching the movies and the shows being made, because they're also becoming more processed as well and searching for atmosphere. So it's really just on par with what we're seeing. Sorry, I'm not really answering the question well, but
No, I on the contrary, I think that's absolutely true. And that's That's what Marty, my friend that did the Halo games, was saying. It's just, this is the world we live in, and you have to be fluent at it and able to interface to some degree if you want to get ahead. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry, no, I'll just throw one thing in for as people are writing and experimenting in this. I always tell people a few things to keep in mind, though, is electronics keyboards, they do vertical very, very well.
Yeah.
They don't do linear writing as well. And the best scores you hear produced this way often still are paying attention to voice leading and where things are going. And basic things like structure, architecture, are just as relevant to John Corigliano as they are to John Williams, as they are to whatever score being made today, as they are to a concert piece. It's all of that is very relevant. Learning how to write really idiomatically for instruments, even if they're going to be artificial instruments, makes a difference.
Right.
And informing what you're doing electronically with the training of how this stuff works in the real world is very important. But the linearity, for sure, you can always tell people who are paying attention to that.
Yeah, that's, I taught another class today with the grad students who are looking at wind repertoire. And so we're listening to music, and we were talking exactly about this in our class. The fact that some of the groups that are recording this, they're taking 8 passes at a phrase in the studio. And they have people sitting around a table that are just listening to flutes, and one guy's just listening to clarinets. And if they hear anything, they stop, and then they do it again, they do it again. So when you listen to the recording for non-professional students, even though they're at some of the elite universities or whatever, sure, vertically it's amazing. There's beautiful sounds being played, but there's not a lot of line. It's really hard to find line in the music. And I worry about that for the creative field for the future, and how sort of narrative arc in music may be sort of knocked off the rails by just the environment, only hearing verticality and that sort of aggressive thing. That concerns me a little bit, just about what we use music for in terms of reflecting our human condition and the narratives we're all living out, the journey. So yeah. So here's what I want to do, because I want to be cognizant of the time. Let's take a minute for questions, if the students have any questions. And then Chris, when we take a few questions, I'd like you to describe for Christopher kind of where we're at now, and just kind of what we talked about earlier today in terms of what the students have to do next. I thought it would be really useful for him to give us some advice. And Mary, I know you might have an obligation, and I don't want to keep you. You're welcome to stay or go, but in case you decide to leave, everybody turn your microphone on, and let's clap for Mary Lynch, please. Here we go. Yay, Mary Lynch. Thank you, thank you.
I'm fine until 5. Just
good. Oh, good. Well, we clapped anyway. Yeah, let's clap again. So Chris Mathical, are you there?
Yep.
So you want to, let's do some questions.
The students haven't sent me any questions yet. So if you want me to describe kind of where we are in the project as they send me questions, hopefully, that'll be great. So again, for all the students, if you want to directly send me any questions you have, you can ask them, or I can ask them on your behalf. But anyway, thank you so much, Christopher, for joining us. I'm Chris, I'm one of the TAs for this class. So right now, if you've read the project, I think Professor Sullivan might have sent it to you. Everyone sort of recorded these 15-second stems along with a provided drone, and they submitted them. And they're like in teams based on their instrument. So all the clarinets are together, all the high brass are together. And now what they need to do is take all their team's little stems and sort of mix them together in any way they want. And it's the hope is to kind of get everyone used to using various mixing software and getting used to that side of it if they haven't done it before, but also for them to be able to exercise some of their creative muscles while still working with the constraints of course, having to use these little things that everyone has provided and they didn't necessarily know what that was going to be beforehand.
So Christopher, you heard that the technical challenge that they're facing. I thought it would be useful for you to describe just sort of composition parameters, things to think about, you know, augmentation, diminution, shape, whatever, architecture, the kind of things, if you were in one of these, we call them sound teams, the kind of raw materials you have to work with relative to creativity.
Yeah, good question. For me, everything starts with, yeah, I don't want to say what it is you're trying to express, but perspective on it, which then informs structure. And laying out a structure musically or with a graph or whatever you're going to do, whatever visual aid you need or whatever that's going to be. And I'm not talking about just, you know, sonata, allegro form, here's your A, here's your B, or however you're going to do that, or like coming up with a large scale idea of where this is going to go, or a small scale idea of where it's going to go, and what you're trying to do, because that will start informing how, if you're taking cells and building with them, how you're using them to build in what direction. Once you kind of, I always find when I have that laid out, the rest of it starts falling in place a lot quicker. So it's, yeah, for me, it's really about perspective, architecture, then start filling it in and work from there.
Yeah, John Corigliano wrote the foreword to my third book, to our third book, and he sent, he works with these big graphs.
Yes.
And he sent me the graph for Circus Maximus, which is this giant piece he wrote for Wind Ensemble. You may or may not know it. It's very loud. And in the beautiful moments, it's very beautiful. But anyhow, I actually had that here in my home. I was so scared of something was going to happen to it. Would that be a useful thing for the team to sort of agree upon given the fact that all these stems may or may not have anything to do with each other than the fact that they were played over an A-flat drone, might they start with some sense of that kind of a shape?
Yeah, I totally agree, because if you're going to start working additively, for instance, with these cells, it's how to pace it then. Things become about pacing or timing of where you want to get from A to B, essentially, or B to C, how C is going to be related to A. So if you have bits of cells and you're adding them to one another or using them to develop essentially that way, your structure might be, well, we're layering them in a certain way at the beginning, and then we're going to augment or diminute or whatever you want to do with them as you develop it or as you add another layer to it. Or if you're going to explore some polytonality with it, by C, are you wanting to come back to A? Are you going to do some variation of whatever texture you've created in A? So that starts to play with scale, and in taking almost maybe chaotic ideas and essentially trying to find order within the chaos is what that starts to do. So yeah, and I love the idea of John Corigliano's ideas of using graphics scales helps you take a larger scale and really bring it down to that so you can manage it.
Yeah, and I really liked what you said. You were talking, you kept saying additive, and then you finally said it, texture. That having that overlay, that arc, or whatever it is you want to call it, doesn't have to be an arc, and how texture, you manipulate texture, among other things, to sort of fulfill that part of the journey, or that shape of the journey, I guess is a better way to put it. What other things? Yeah. What other things can they draw from in terms of compositional devices? Like if you were teaching compositional class, okay, class, we're going to learn about X. What would it be? Like relative to the manipulation of motives or whatever.
So manipulation of motives.
Things like augmentation and diminution and how that interfaces with texture and et cetera.
Yeah, I was trying to think of a good example, because part of it in my mind is when you're going with textural ideas, they become boring actually quite quickly. So it's how to make it interesting, but how to develop it in non-traditional ways. And so taking inspiration essentially from, like, we're visually around us, we're faced with a lot of static things in our world that are elusively static, but relate to one another in different ways through transition or through shading or through how lights or touches colors, and how you're essentially pulling away or adding to, and how those morph together. So I think there's a lot of, if you want to go on an abstract level, a lot of things around us where we can start to see these structures laid out. And I guess in terms of texture, and we can bring Mary in on this one, is the Seattle Symphony has recorded a number of pieces by John Luther Adams. And he uses texture amazingly. I used to actually, when I first heard them, I thought they were aleatoric scores, but they're not. It's actually all notated out, if I've got that right, Mary. But he changes these textures very, very, very slowly, just in terms of adding little shades in. So start with something, and then something else starts coloring it. And as that coloration moves, this one changes slightly underneath that. So you start getting these different shades, essentially, of coloration, but the changes occur almost staggered, so that by the time you get somewhere and it's changed completely on you, you haven't really noticed it happening. It's almost subliminal in a certain way. But in his Become Ocean, I believe if you actually watch the pedals, so the lowest notes going on, there's actually a rise that goes throughout the piece and essentially comes back down, onto which there are 3 crescendos. And so we're essentially using materials that can be A and Bs and whatever throughout it, but there is this full shape that's occurred. And it's just the subtle shifts of, oh, the pedals changed here, the pedals changed there. And Mary, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about if that's relevant, Tim, but it's
very, very much so.
Yeah, I mean, I actually was not on the Become Ocean recording. That was the year before I joined the orchestra, but we did Become Desert a couple years ago, or yeah, 2 years ago. Yeah, and it is very much like that. I sort of thought of his piece start to finish as being like a sound bath. I don't know if anybody here has ever experienced something like that. It's pretty cool. Like, I go to a yoga studio where they do these sound baths with gongs and like Tibetan singing bowls. So that's sort of what I likened that experience to.
A sound bath. That's cool. That's really neat. I just keep thinking about things that I want to help the students with to try to get them to sort of jumpstart this process. And so I've been looking for inspiration, and I had one today that was really weird. We were outside getting ready to go on a big walk, and my wife pointed out to me that if you stood in a certain way and you just looked at the blue sky, the pollen was so thick that it was like snow, like yellow snow across. And I thought, there's a lot of soundscapes like that, where there is a pervasive, embedded thing that you can barely hear that never stops. And some of the students have done really cool stuff that way. In fact, one of the oboists played like false fingerings, and there's just a lot of harmonic and kind of white noise. So the stems that I've heard, I'm pretty excited about, because they're thinking outside the box. So I think we have some good things ahead. Any other questions, Christopher, Chris Mathical, rather, from anybody?
Yeah, so we got a few questions now.
Great.
So I'll ask one on behalf of a student. When mixing and adjusting tracks, why run a compressor? And how often are dynamics electronically adjusted after recording?
I guess I'll have to speak to this on 2 levels. If we're talking classical recording, not so much. If we're talking recording for commercial projects, tinkered with probably a fair amount, depending stylistically again. So if we're some of the traditional scores you hear, I always think of fellow Bruce Broughton, who is a fantastic composer down in Hollywood. A lot of the CDs that you hear of his music and what went to the film was essentially recorded off of, although they multi-tracked it, they just used the stereo pair because everything balanced beautifully. And there was no need, and he's just a fantastic writer, so it always works. These days, there's more and more and more tinkering. You're not going to hear a low flute or two alto flutes and a flute playing in the low register against a wall of brass, for instance. And you will hear these kinds of things in soundtracks. So there is a lot of tinkering going on. Why use compression? Compression for film and television, compression essentially is helping our music survive. Because it's going to be obliterated by a lot of other things, sound effects tracks, dialogue tracks, everything else. So we want it to live as best we can. But it also makes it a little bit faster on the television side for mixers to be able to mix against it when you look at a waveform, if it's a little bit more compressed. It also gives it a certain life that probably wouldn't have without it. In classical music, compression a little bit lighter, but you're bringing things into leveling off those dynamics a little bit, so it's a little bit easier to listen to sometimes, but we try not to do it too terribly much. Different kinds of compression, you'll want to compress a drum track differently than you're going to compress your orchestra track, in the simplest of terms, just because it'll make things pop a little bit differently. Like I wouldn't use the same compression, say, on the big, dark, deep synthesizers as I am on the high end of the orchestra. But generally, it brings things into focus. It gives the music a more focused sound and brings the nuances out a little bit more, and essentially helps it survive. Is probably the fastest answer I can give.
That's great. Thank you, Chris.
I have another question about the use of silence. What are your thoughts on using silence in pieces? And might they be effective in conveying a theme or feeling?
All depends on how you use it. I love silence, and naturally silence is part of music, obviously to the extreme of John Cage, but silence it's all up to the creativity of the individual, how you're going to use it. It can be a theme, and I've heard pieces that use silence within the piece essentially as a recurring idea. In the simplest of terms, I think silence is important because music breathes, we all breathe, and we need to have that lift in it. It's a natural thing to do. I think especially as wind players, it's a very natural thing to do. So I think it's very important, but I also think it helps give the audience points where they can almost reflect and take in what's going on, whether we're closing an idea or a phrase or not. It allows the audience a moment, essentially. And I think that's very important, to let the idea sort of marinate a little bit sometimes. So yeah, it's all up to the composer. It can also be very tiring if music is just relentlessly always going on without it. So it's a natural thing.
I have another question. What has changed significantly from your early compositions to the later, and why?
Yeah, I probably wrote a little bit more in terms of concert music. I probably wrote much more filmically early on, and hopefully less so now, because I'm trying to kind of go in different directions that way. So I think I embrace a little bit more, like I'm by no means a radical composer at all, but hopefully the language I'm focusing down onto is becoming a little bit clearer. And I often say that composition is actually not an additive process as you go through. I think when you're in university, it's by all means explore, try out different things, try out different styles, and do all the things that you have the access to people to experiment with and try, or be conservative with and try, whichever way you want to go. It's like the world is your oyster. And I actually regret not having experimented a little bit more with my music while I was at university. But I think as you kind of go in a composer's life, it's actually more of a focusing of what your language is going to be optimally into who you are, what you want to express, how you want to express it, and how you can do that in the most focused and pointed way possible. And I think as you look at a lot of composers, Arvo Pärt, for instance, or Phil Glass, or John Corigliano, a lot of them, it's really a focusing in as they've gone through their career into what this nugget is that they're trying to explore. And so I think I'm hopefully on all fronts becoming a little bit more economical with the material I'm using and how I'm using it, and trying to make it a little bit more focused and economic that way, rather than trying to throw everything, including the kitchen sink, in all the time.
That was great. Chris, any more?
Yeah, I've got one more question. This one is from Mary. And this is a question about oboe repertoire. With some of the instruments, you have a lot of transcriptions in the solo repertoire. Does this happen for oboes as well, or are most of the pieces in the repertoire originally written for oboe?
I'd say that most of the pieces, most of the concertos, or any solo works at least, are written for oboe that oboe players play frequently. I'm trying to think of any transcriptions that are played by oboe players. Occasionally we borrow things from saxophone that tends to kind of work on either instrument. But yeah, most of the pieces that you'll hear a solo oboist play were actually written for the oboe.
Well, good. If we're all out of questions, I just really appreciate it, you two. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy life to join us. And above all, please stay safe, keep your hands washed, and we'll look forward to making music in person. And Christopher, I hope it works out when we get to do this, that you can come down. That would be awesome.
Yeah, wouldn't miss it.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. But you've helped us a lot and spoken into the process that they're involved in, and just hearing about your journey and stuff, I just really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Everybody turn off your sound, turn on your mic and clap for these guys, everybody.